blah 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 blah, spoilers, blah blah blah. You know the drill. So here's the thing. So I've been going through a moment where I'm like, I don't know that I want to be an internet person anymore and like do this. And I think in a lot of ways that's true. I don't. But also I keep coming back and forth to like whether I want to publish this review since I wrote it. And I feel like I just kind of have to at this point. So I'm sorry. I wrote it. The work's already done. Who knows if I'll do any more. I'll leave my channel up, but I don't know. Something just about this all, I'm just like, maybe I'm done. But, you know, I may have abandoned entirely the YouTube playthrough of this, but I did just beat Final Fantasy VII Remake, so I figured I'd at least write the review, and I guess I am gonna publish it. I'm gonna be honest, I was even boring myself with this one, and I'm just losing steam with playthroughs in general. Be that as it may, I still enjoy making videos and most importantly writing, so I definitely wanted to get my thoughts out there about this game, especially since it consumed a not insignificant chunk of my life. If you haven't watched any of my other reviews, that's okay because this one's going to be a little different. Usually I take a more conversational approach where I'll just kind of talk through some key observations and how they came off to me. As is my wont, I'm still going to come off a bit rambly in this one, but I'm going to be scoring the two categories I discuss here, gameplay and writing. I'll also put my overall scores for both of the categories I cover in the video's description, along with just a couple of the main points for each one. The main reason for this edition is the following. You're probably getting tired of hearing this, but I am an ardent fan of the original Final Fantasy VII. Square-Enix took the FF7 remake in a lot of directions that I didn't personally love, from the combat systems to some major plot updates. That being said, this is, for the most part, a high-quality, fun game. I'm going to say some negative things, but my scores may not line up with my overall feelings about this game. Like, I'm going to do my best here to parse out the stuff that just didn't line up with what I wanted out of a remake of one of my favorite games, from the stuff that I honestly think should prevent this game from getting a perfect 10 in either category. I'll try to make that very important distinction clear as we get through the various parts of the review. With that out of the way, let's start with a gameplay experience, and first up is the combat subcategory. I'm not really going to be talking about my thoughts on classic mode here, as I've got a whole video devoted mostly to that. I did stray off topic in that video for a hot second, but that's because of how I'm choosing to read classic mode in a much wider context as a symptom of a larger issue with the remake project. If you're interested in hearing more about that, feel free, but I'm gonna rein it in a little bit for my review here. Now, I'll admit I got lost for a while down the Reddit rabbit hole about whether this game is truly an action RPG or not, and honestly, the minute I stopped approaching remake like one, I got a whole lot better at this game. Don't get me wrong, I still suck. That being said, Square Enix in my opinion did with FF7 Remake what they do best, experimentation. With the presence of ATP gauges and various ways to fill them, this is truly a hybrid that attempts to take the best of both action and turn-based combat systems. How effective they were at accomplishing this is up for debate. Personally, I think they were pretty successful. I just really wanted true turn-based, so I was never going to like this. But to sing the combat system's praises, the tactical menu is sleek and minimally invasive, and it's really nice how things slow down to almost a complete halt when you engage with it so you can carve out time to think amidst all the real-time chaos. I also like that there were two options for utilizing other party members. At times, it might be strategic to switch complete control over to another character and wail on enemies with Barret from long range, for instance. But you could also just switch to their tactical menu and have them use a specific skill at an opportune moment, all while still maintaining control of the character you want to use in that moment. There were a lot of smart design choices, but that one might take the cake. Though I still walked away from this experience with more than a little frustration, I completely recognize that that is mostly due to my own predilections. This is a quality combat experience that feels so thoughtful, innovative, and efficient. There are some really nice nods to the original FF7 experience and some smart updates, and hey, I've always been a huge fan of the risks Square Enix takes in their combat experiences. They may not always be a hit with everyone, but you've got to admire the willingness to take chances, make mistakes, get messy, and not just stick with the tried and true. Big fucking however. I have a major complaint about boss fights, and this is not a mere matter of preference. One thing you're encouraged to do in combat is stagger your opponents to help give yourself an edge in the fight and deal some serious damage while you're at it. It's a pretty cool thing that I try to do a lot because strategy. Boss fights, though, were an immense frustration because of the numerous, I would say too many, stages in them that all left me feeling like the wind had been taken out of my sails whenever a new stage in a boss fight would rear its ugly head. Here's why. You're doing your thing, doing minimal damage to that big boy's health, which doesn't bother you because not only are you a brave little toaster, you're a smart one too. While that boss has the audacity to think he's having his way with you, you're watching that stagger gauge slowly fill up, eagerly awaiting your moment to stick it to the cocky bastard. You're just a couple more hits away from maximum payback time when a quasi cutscene interrupts the flow of combat. This is the moment, perhaps even one of multiple, in this particular boss fight's narrative arc where you really get to see before your very eyes how big and tough this big boy really is. The nice part about this is you get to put the controller down for a sec while the boss whips out his dick and hands you a ruler. The not so nice part? All that effort to stagger has now just gone down the drain. Why? Fucking why? This pissed me off every fucking time. Jesus Christ. The sheer amount of times that this happened, as well as just the amount of interruptions in boss fights, at least for me, ruined the flow of combat. Getting to the next stage of a boss fight didn't feel like the reward it should have been because it came at the expense of my progress towards staggering my opponent. Not cool. I only want to mention one last thing about the combat. I've seen some complaints from people across the internet and even in my own comment section basically saying that, even on the highest difficulty, this game is too easy. Well, my friends, that was a far cry from my experience. In my opinion, the standard difficulty is actually too punishing. And I'm willing to budge on this one as someone who doesn't play a lot of action RPGs, but I just feel like if I'm paying attention, my characters shouldn't be dying as many times as they did. Like, with enough grit and just generally not being a dumbass, I should just be able to eke out a victory. I'm not bad at video games. I'll be the first to admit I'm not great at this particular variety, but I lift, bro. And sure, punish me for casting magic when you've cast Reflect. Punish me for charging in recklessly when you set up a physical counter. Seriously, punish me, daddy. But I just felt overall the combat experience on the standard difficulty is much too punishing for people who play RPGs primarily for the story but also want an engaging and challenging gameplay experience. Like, save that shit for hard mode. Again, I don't play a lot of action RPGs, perhaps I'm out of my depth here, but those are the feelings I was left with from my experience. Moving on to some other aspects of gameplay, let's talk about character growth and progression. And to clarify, I'm not talking about character growth from a writing standpoint. We'll get to that later. I'm talking about beefing up our main cast of baddies with EXP and other bells and whistles. Now, this first criticism is going to hinge a lot on personal preference, so obviously this in no way impacts the overall score. Throughout much of the game, there really aren't good opportunities to grind. I eventually gave up on trying to work against the game's anti-grind design and just trusted in the process. By that I mean I did every side quest available. This leads me to my main point here. By design, Remake is anti-grind with a few exceptions. You don't at any point need to grind, and in fact, there are systems in place to ensure you are sufficiently prepared for and capable of taking on each new challenge without needing to farm EXP. If playing on the standard difficulty, doing every side quest available, as well as the Coliseum, VR, and training simulation missions will set you up nicely to get through the entire game. If instead you're a stubborn dinosaur like moi and try to revisit areas with the intention of grinding, you will get, for the most part, very minimal returns. Like, the Gorgers in the factory in Sector 7 offer a little bit, especially since they respawn fairly quickly, but I just couldn't make it worth it. Spamming Don Corneo's Coliseum could work too, but I just wish there had been a few places I could revisit that were absolutely crawling with enemies, but again, Remake's design kinda just works against grinding in general because that's a part of the RPG experience the devs wanted to leave in the past. And the anti-grind setup is fine, it saw me reliably through to the end, so I really can only complain about this as a matter of personal preference. But again, I love grinding. It's a huge part of my RPG experience and something I wanted to see in a remake. And here's the thing. I know grinding is monotonous. Some might go so far as to say boring. But the thing I love about grinding is that I'm in control. If I can't get past something, I only have myself to blame. With Remake's setup, I had to trust that my characters were high enough levels because there weren't reliable places to farm experience for large chunks of the game. And add on top of that my lack of skill pertaining to this class of RPGs, and you can see how that made me a little uncomfortable. I know it's too late, but to make a long story short, Remake's setup works, it's just not how I like to approach RPGs. That actually speaks to my larger point about Remake in general really nicely. Gameplay-wise, Remake has a lot of really good things that just aren't for me. I hope up to this point I've conveyed that clearly. I don't like it, it's not for me, but I'm glad I played it. It's an excellent game mostly. I think the writing overall should have been better, but I walk away from the experience hopeful that I'll like Rebirth a lot more than its predecessor. Now, something related to character growth that didn't work for me was the weapon upgrade system. Hear me out. It's a really great system that gives you so many options regarding speccing your characters to suit various needs in combat. That's really smart and amazing, and it also changes up the very worn out with the old, in with the new pattern for equipment in traditional RPGs. My only problem with it is the execution. It looks really cool and is kinda reminiscent of sphere grids and license boards from earlier titles, but good lord, navigating through each weapon's... Is it a solar system? And spending skill points takes so fucking long. I dreaded level ups because I knew I'd have more points to spend, which would mean spending a good 5 to 10 minutes on this tedious process, because not very far into the game, you have access to all 4 playable characters and their multiple weapons, most of them needing upgrades upon each level up. Looked super cool, felt super tedious. Not much else to say about that. The last part I feel I need to touch on has to do with exploration. One of my favorite parts about Remake is how much Square Enix fleshes out the world of Final Fantasy VII in vividly beautiful detail. There are so many things to explore, so many people just trying to live their lives while we're bumbling about and generally making things worse for the average Joseph and Josephine. It's so cool to see familiar places built up with such a loving attention to detail. At first, I was so excited to explore to my heart's content. But there is a criminal amount of hand-holding going on that honestly put a bad taste in my mouth and made me less curious at times. Like, let me as the player explore and find the cool and or useful things. I take pride in that. That's not for Cloud, that part's for me. Don't yank my camera toward the thing I'm supposed to interact with in order to get past the section. Maybe after a certain amount of time has expired, but let me get a lay of the land for myself. Also, don't point out the shiny thing and then be all like, ooh, how you gonna get there? I can see the shiny. I don't need you to point it out or have one of the other party members do that. A big example of this early on is when you're on that incredibly drawn out trek to the second reactor target and you're walking along that pipe. It's a perilous spot with some big fans generating some forceful winds. Pretty exhilarating. During that sequence, Tifa tells Cloud not to look at the fans. I assume so he pays attention to his footing while being buffeted by the wind. If you played many RPGs, the player's natural impulse is to do what you're not supposed to do because of how many times we've been rewarded for doing just that. I already wanted to look at the fans, but then Barret and Tifa literally draw your focus to the summoned materia that is currently out of your reach behind one of the giant-ass fans. Stop that. This happens too often. Let me explore. Let me figure things out. I don't need you. I know there's some realism lost because obviously these characters who actually inhabit the world would want to react to the things they observe, but the devs could have totally made that come across without stomping all over the player's natural impulse to explore. To be clear, this is not a preference. I truly believe that the exploration was much better in OG FF7 because there really wasn't a lot of hand-holding. You want the best summon in the game? Explore every inch of the world map. Go beyond what you thought was accessible to you. Now, I have another thing I want to bring up regarding exploration, but that more pertains to the writing, so I'm gonna hold off until I get to that section of the review. All in all, gameplay is really solid. It's sleek, it's sexy, and even though it's really not what I wanted, I know a lot of people are really happy with it for very good reasons. Not my cup of tea, but it's sitting at a solid 8.5 out of 10 in my book. Would be a 9 if not for those aspects that really annoyed me, like the interruptions in boss fights, the tedious weapon upgrade interface, and some overall hand-holding. None of those were too big a deal, but all of them together were enough to bring that score down from excellent to great. And with that, there's really nothing left I want to talk about except the writing. Again, if you've watched any of my extra content videos, you should know by now I'm not a fan of the whispers. As I already put out a video just on that, just like with classic mode, I'm not going to go into great detail about my thoughts on the whispers here and will instead talk about some of the other strengths and weaknesses of the writing. Suffice it to say, they're contrived and heavy-handed. To get right to the heart of the issue, the whispers manufacture a sense of urgency for Remake's version of events that I just don't actually feel. It's a weak position to put Remake's narrative in. Just fucking rewrite Final Fantasy VII and make updates. This pissed me off so much. Also, the final showdown with the whispers looked way too much like Kingdom Hearts, and not in a good way. Jesus Christ. Okay, deep breaths. Let's start with what I really love about the writing and where it really shines, the characters. That's not hard. The characters were compelling to begin with all the way back in the original. But the updates? man, there are some really smart writerly moves. And while in side-by-side comparisons I might prefer how a character was characterized in a given moment in the original, I find it incredibly fascinating to study how Remake handles moments differently. Maybe they go about trying to emphasize the same facet of a character, just in a slightly different way. Or maybe they try to bring another quality forward entirely. Either way, this is my biggest buy-in to Remake, hands down. I love the writing process. It's really special that we have such a unique window into the minds of both the writing teams of the original and the remake, if we look at them side by side. Very cool. To get somewhat specific, we see in subtle ways throughout that Cloud is more than just a cocky, spiky-headed asshole. I mean, he is that in a lot of ways, but the amount of emotional range and depth they give him, the amount of times I was genuinely surprised by his willingness to show a more vulnerable side, chef's kiss. This needed to be here in Remake, and the writers absolutely delivered. And Tifa, good god, this babe got the glow-up she deserved. We see this as early as our first encounter with her, but the journey to the second reactor does so much work with her characterization. And the OG Tifa is all excitement about going with Cloud to the second reactor target. On the train, some of her fear and hesitation come across, as well as her feelings for Cloud. And that's it. Pretty basic. In Remake, we see her questioning Barret, we see her compassion for the innocent people whose entire lives and livelihoods will be fucked, all for the sake of what Barret, acting on behalf of Avalanche, thinks is right. And most importantly, we see her take charge. Those other things are still there, but there is so much more. The other character I think got some very interesting updates is Aerith. Honestly, I think I've fallen for her more than Tifa. I didn't expect this, but those facial expressions and line deliveries, she's so earnest and good in spite of all that she knows. And all of that comes across. In OG FF7, I was heartbroken by the infamous tragedy, but I could quickly move on to Tifa. Given how well Aerith is portrayed in Remake, I don't think I'll be able to do that, so Square Enix, please, do not fuck me again. My heart just can't take it. Aside from that, the little things that she says that draw our attention to her unreasonable amount of knowledge about Destiny in the original context are so subtle and interesting. Honestly, I could maybe stomach this fate shtick that brings in the original context if we just got it through Aerith and the rogue people suffering from Mako poisoning we come across on our journey. Again, the whispers just make it way too heavy-handed. Before moving on to some of the secondary characters, I do just want to touch on Barret and how he was handled, because I think he got the worst treatment out of the main cast. While the updates to Tifa's presentation are really cool as we make our way to the second reactor target, just in putting Barret under the microscope in that same scene, he doesn't come across as the leader he was in the original. Case in point, he doesn't tell Cloud and Tifa to jump first and insists that a good leader stays till the last so he can ensure the safety of the others. Instead, in this scene as well as just in general, we see a lot more of his range of emotions. He's apprehensive about Cloud's recommendation to slow the train so they can jump off, but we very prominently see him build up the courage to jump first and show them how it's done. But we don't get as much depth, in my opinion, as we get from some of the other characters. Remake takes this big hulking baddie daddy with a gun arm and emphasizes some of his softer qualities to make him interesting and complex, give him some range. But I think some of those stronger redeeming qualities we saw in the original just don't come across as well. The other problem is too many of Barret's lines deal in the realm of ideals and abstractions. They aren't grounded enough in relatable, concrete desires. I get that he's the leader and he wants to keep everyone focused on the greater good of saving the dying planet, but I think we needed more personal stake from him to get at that depth that I feel is missing. Marlene is obviously his walking, talking skin in the game, but the scenes with her feel underutilized. I don't know. Like, of course he cares about this grand idea of saving the planet, which is admirable, but so much of his rhetoric is about his bleeding heart for this larger-than-life thing and the capital I injustices that Shinra is committing against the planet, and not enough of it actually gets to the heart of what Barret is personally fighting for. But most importantly, I really didn't like the Barret we got on the roof of the Shinra building. Keep in mind that this series of events is completely unique to Remake. Before I jump in with my thoughts, I do want to throw out there that there are some wonderful conversations on Reddit and other places where people are doing some incredibly deep, insightful readings. I highly recommend looking into it. It's pretty cool to see others talk about the various strengths and weaknesses of this particular scene, precisely because it doesn't have a counterpart in the original. And I just want to add my thoughts as well, because from what I could see, no one was talking about what bothered me about it. After Barret taunts President Shinra with the fact that the latter's life is literally in his hands, Barret, with some shockingly necessary encouragement from Tifa and the others, eventually does the right thing and saves him. After a little chase, President Shinra rightfully gets his moment of throwing everything in Barret's face for his seeming to be more concerned about correcting Avalanche's image than upholding the values it claims to fight for. Now that was actually a really interesting reversal that got me thinking critically, but also we have all of this cruelty and misguidedness coming from Barret here, and we don't get any substantial hints at any point in Remake about why there might be so much malice in his heart. Though us original fans absolutely know how bad Shinra fucked him earlier on in his life in Coral. Because Remake doesn't even hint at that context, he seems almost villain-like here, like the villain who thought he was playing the hero all along. That was hard to watch precisely because I know from later on in the original's plot that I should feel sympathy for him. But with that piece missing from Remake, I really didn't want to here. It was actually really hard to watch him struggle with this inner conflict as he dangles President Shinra over the edge of the Shinra building, because Remake doesn't give us enough insight. Like I sat there thinking, fuck dude, I think you should leave. And again, this wasn't a problem in the original, and we could wait on Barret's backstory until later because this scene never happened. But I'd argue we do need it in Remake for this scene especially, and this feels like a pretty big oversight. The writing gives us so much context for the other main characters, but I think Barret was a bit of a blind spot. We needed something to act as a counterweight during this incredibly charged scene between President Shinra and him, otherwise he just comes off too cruel. For the most part, the writing of the main characters is so strong and on point. Even when I preferred characterization moments in the original, I appreciated all of the moves generally, except in the case of Barret. Again, the primary takeaway for me is that the writers did a much better job with his range, but they missed a step in establishing his depth as strongly as the other characters. If we wanted to have him actually confront President Shinra, unlike how things go in the original, I just feel we needed some additional context to balance it out. Aside from the main cast, I thought there were some interesting choices with some of the secondary characters, even if the characters themselves weren't all so interesting. Madam M, Chocobo Sam, and Andrea are probably the most engaging secondary characters. They can all get it, and I'm glad I got to spend some time with each and every one of them. Roche and Johnny serve no meaningful purpose. I hope to never see them again. If they do come back in Rebirth, the writers are going to have to do a much better job of arguing for their significance, though Jessie definitely gets the all-star treatment, and rightfully so. Wedge's character development was a pleasant surprise. It did not look good at the outset for this apparent Choji Akamichi clone, but by the end, I've gotta admit, the writers redeemed themselves. Woodfuck Biggs, how they managed to make a character who barely even registered on my radar in the original into an absolute fuck machine might be the greatest characterization achievement in this entire game. That being said, the dark horse in the man crush competition y'all didn't know I had signed us all up for is obviously Reeve. You might have your hands tied in regard to fixing Midgar, but you can tie my hands and fix me, daddy. I could say more about the characters, but I don't want to. It's mostly good. Again, they were already such strong characters, kinda hard to fuck it up, but I was glad to see that for the most part, the writers knocked it out of the park in respect to the writing of the characters. Where the team didn't do so well in my opinion is in the overall pacing. This kinda goes along with gameplay because a not insignificant portion of a RPG story unfolds through advancing the plot via gameplay, so that makes sense. We are being told a story, sure, but by virtue of the genre's own name, we are playing a role in that story's progression. Shit happens, you find out you need to get to a new destination, and then more shit happens, not to mention the shit that happens along the way. Not a hard concept to grasp. In my opinion, however, a criminal amount of sections of chapters overstayed their welcome. By and large, whatever slog of the day I had to get through made any story updates I was rewarded with feel kinda not worth the effort. It didn't need to take so long just to get to the second reactor target. We didn't need more than 2 crane puzzles while escorting Aerith back to her home. Also, while making the random encounter bandits from the original into more fleshed out characters was interesting at first, Beck's badasses took up way too much oxygen in the room. One and done was all we needed from them, and don't get me started on the train graveyard. I wanted to love it. I actually did at first and got very excited at the beginning of that section, and then, just like so many before it, it dragged on interminably. Good God, pacing is key in any story, and with RPGs, unfortunately, you've got to think about the balance between plot advancement and gameplay. Quite a few people refer to this issue I'm dancing around as the bloat. Though the name oogs me out, I think it gets at the problem pretty effectively. Before moving on, I want to give some credit where credit is due. Other issues, I don't think you can make this argument, but the bloat, at least in my opinion, is a problem born out of an immense amount of love for the original Final Fantasy VII. In writing anything, whether it's an entirely original project or a remake/reimagining, you absolutely have to nurture and encourage the impulse to expand, to leave no stone unturned in terms of world building. That boundless curiosity is key to creating some magical moments for your players. It's important to start there. And clearly, the writers wanted to expand in so many different directions and did. I think their overall excitement and love really shines through, but again, professional writers getting paid should start there and then make cuts where necessary in order to ensure that the pacing is on point as well. Good pacing encourages us to take our time and enjoy the ride while also ensuring that entire sections of chapters don't feel like a pointless slog. For my last comment on the writing, I'd like to bring us back to the idea of exploration. I talked about how my desire to explore and interact with the beautifully expanded environments was undercut at parts by some serious hand-holding, which I very much did not appreciate. In a somewhat similar way, I also felt burned by the writing and how obviously on the rails of the story we were at parts. A clear example of this occurs during the wall market portion when we get Cloud gussied up to the nines before infiltrating Don Corneo's mansion. What I love about the original is that the events themselves unfolded in slightly different ways depending on your actions and how deeply invested you were in exploring this very kooky corner of Midgar. You could just go through and advance the plot. Either Tifa or Aerith would get selected and then boom, you come in and save the day. Or you could scour every inch of Wall Market, determined to get Cloud the best wig, the best dress, etc. Also that Don Corneo would select him. Exploration in the original iteration of this portion had a direct impact on how the story unfolded. In Remake, that's not the case. All it affects is the cosmetics. And I get it. The writers needed Cloud to get selected because there was a really important bonding scene between Aerith and Tifa that is so revelatory. Like, we see them get closer together and muster up the resolve to save Cloud, and a nice reversal of the damsel in distress dynamic. I guess my main point is that moves like this one, necessary and smart though they are, make exploration and investment in the world feel less rewarding. It's Square Enix's story. Your curiosity and love for the world they've created take a backseat to what they want to tell you. Like, yes, love the world, explore it to your heart's content, but it has no bearing outside of your just enjoyment that you derive from it. And that left a bad taste in my mouth because of the larger context of all of the choices, big and small, they made that get at this same thing. So many of us wanted this because the original is so special to us. Square Enix had an opportunity to honor that and make us feel, even if it would only ever be an illusion, that we were a part of this. Instead, the rails of the story are very obvious at parts, and it just feels like they put in a lot of effort to make it abundantly clear that this is their story. It may be special to us, but that's not really the important thing here. All we're left with as the player is essentially a choice between taking the elevator or the stairs. Cool. All in all, I'd give the writing a 7 out of 10. The mostly brilliant characterization more than makes up for any shortcomings. I have some serious issues with the more contrived elements and the pacing, but now that we discovered once and for all that Kingdom Hearts is light, we better be done with those fucking Dementors. Seriously, just tell the fucking story, changes and all. In closing, Final Fantasy VII Remake is not for everybody, and it certainly wasn't for me. I'm glad I played it all the way through, finally as a fan of the original, but I won't be playing it again. From what I've heard about and seen of Rebirth, I think I'm gonna like that part a whole lot better. I surprise even myself when I say this last thing though. If you love the original FF7 and think you might feel similar to me about Remake, but just haven't gotten around to it yet, I still urge you to play it. Or if you played it and feel like it's the worst thing ever and the original deserved a better remake, give it a second chance with the following mindset. The best and most rewarding part of my playthrough was being able to compare the writerly moves made in each iteration. It's such a unique window into the video game writing process, and you won't be disappointed if you focus on that. Just something to consider. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Peace.